Something is badly wrong when a government's biggest problem is not what it failed to know, but what it knew and pushed past anyway. This is the kind of story that starts as a personnel scandal and ends as a test of whether the state still has working brakes. At first glance, it looks like one fallen man, one toxic association, one political embarrassment. Look closer, and you begin to see something more disturbing, a governing system that may have recognized the danger, named it, and still kept moving. Before we get into it, subscribe to the channel and support the work. That support helps us keep producing sharp, honest analysis like this. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Let's be clear from the start, this is not just a scandal about Peter Mandelson. It is a test of government. It is a test of how power behaves when warning signs are no longer theoretical, when risk is no longer hidden, and when the people at the top have to choose between institutional discipline and political convenience. That is why this story matters far beyond Westminster. For American viewers, the point is not simply that Britain appointed the wrong man to the wrong role. The point is that the role itself matters enormously. The UK ambassador to Washington is not a decorative post. It sits at the center of intelligence trust, defense coordination, diplomatic signaling, trade pressure, and the daily maintenance of one of the most important strategic relationships in the democratic world. So when the Mandelson documents began to come out, this stopped being a British soap opera. This became a serious question about state judgment. Did the system see the risk? Did senior officials understand the implications? Did people in power decide that the upside of the appointment was worth the danger? Those are not gossip questions. Those are regime questions. Because governments rarely break down in public because they knew nothing. They break down when voters realize the people in charge had enough information to be careful, and chose instead to be confident. That is where the real damage begins. In politics, confidence can look like strength right up until the moment it is exposed as indulgence. And in economics, we know what happens when institutions keep discounting known liabilities because the asset looks attractive in the short term. Eventually the hidden cost comes due. That is what this scandal is starting to resemble, a political version of mispriced risk. Mandelson was not just a name. He was a bet. A bet that his experience, reach, and usefulness could outweigh the reputational, moral, and institutional danger attached to him. And if that is what happened, then the real failure was not personal. It was structural. That is why this story should hold your attention all the way through. Because the documents already released are troubling enough. But the documents still withheld may be even more explosive. And when a government's credibility depends not only on what has been revealed, but on what still remains unseen, that is when scandal turns into something much larger, a direct challenge to trust, leadership, and the integrity of the state itself. What the documents clearly reveal about Starmer's prior knowledge. What the documents make unmistakably clear is this: Keir Starmer was not making this appointment in a fog. He may not have known every detail that would later explode into public view, but the record now shows he was not walking blind into danger. He was handed warning signals, and those signals were serious enough that any leader promising discipline, restraint, and clean judgment should have stopped, slowed down, or at the very least demanded a far harder review. That is the heart of this phase of the story. The due diligence material did not describe Peter Mandelson as merely controversial or politically colorful. It flagged what officials called a general reputational risk. That phrase matters. In government language, especially at the level of a major diplomatic appointment, those words are not decorative. They are a signal that risk has moved from rumor into the official bloodstream of the state. Once it is written into the file, it becomes part of the decision itself. No prime minister can later pretend the danger was invisible. And the danger was not abstract. The documents show Starmer was warned that Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein continued after Epstein's 2008 conviction. That single fact changes the entire moral and political equation. There is one standard for an old association that ended before the full scope of disgrace became unavoidable. There is another standard entirely when contact is said to have continued after conviction, after the stain was public, after the world already knew what kind of scandal this was. At that point, the issue is no longer unfortunate proximity. It becomes a question of judgment, boundaries, and character. The file went further. It referenced reporting that Mandelson reportedly stayed at Epstein's house while Epstein was in jail. It also laid out a wider pattern of concern, business entanglements, potential conflicts of interest linked to global counsel, and warnings around his profile as an advocate for closer UK-China relations. On top of that came the historical baggage of a figure who had already been forced out of government twice. Put all of that together, and what emerges is not one isolated red flag. It is a cluster of vulnerabilities sitting in plain sight. This is where the deeper political logic comes in. Governments almost never fail because they lack facts alone. They fail because they discount facts that are inconvenient to a decision they already want to make. That is what appears so dangerous here. Mandelson was not just being assessed as a risk. He was being priced as an asset. His experience, his international profile, his fluency in elite networks, his perceived usefulness in Washington, all of that seems to have raised his political value high enough that the liabilities were treated as manageable rather than disqualifying. That is a familiar pattern in both politics and economics. Leaders convince themselves they are making a sophisticated calculation when in reality they are mispricing downside risk. In market terms, it is what happens when decision-makers chase expected return while softening their model of loss. In government, that mistake is even more expensive, because the loss is not private. It is absorbed by institutions, public trust, diplomatic credibility, and eventually the leader's own authority. So the real significance of these documents is not simply that Starmer knew something. It is that he appears to have known enough that caution should have been the rational response. And once that is true, the question stops being what he knew. The question becomes why he believed he could live with it. The red flags were not hidden. They were overruled. What makes this episode so politically dangerous is not simply that warning signs existed. It is that the warning signs appear to have been seen, voiced, and then pushed aside. That is a far more serious kind of failure. A hidden problem can be explained as oversight. An ignored problem points to something deeper, the way power actually moves inside government when formal caution collides with political preference. The record now suggests that Peter Mandelson was not waved through because nobody noticed the risks. He was waved through even though senior people did notice them. Jonathan Powell, Keir Starmer's national security advisor, later described the appointment process as unusual and weirdly rushed. Those words matter because Powell is not an amateur observer standing at a distance. He understands how sensitive appointments are supposed to work, how reputational risk interacts with national interest, and how dangerous it is when speed starts to outrun scrutiny. When someone with that level of institutional memory raises concern, the system is supposed to slow down. Instead, the process appears to have kept moving. That is where the structure of power becomes more revealing than the facts alone. Powell raised concerns about Mandelson's reputation directly with Morgan McSweeney. According to the documents, McSweeney responded that the issues had been addressed. That response may sound neat on paper, but politically it raises more questions than it resolves. Addressed by what mechanism? Addressed under what standard? Addressed by independent review, or by internal reassurance among people already invested in the appointment? In government, that distinction is everything. Philip Barton also had reservations. That detail should not be underestimated. Barton was not commenting as a rival, an ideologue, or a media critic. He was one of the most senior officials in the Foreign Office. His concerns represent institutional caution from the diplomatic machinery itself. When both the national security side and the senior civil service side signal discomfort, the political center should read that as a flashing red light. If that light was overridden, then this was not merely a mistake in judgment. It was a choice about whose judgment mattered most. And then we come to Matthew Doyle, who was said to be satisfied with Mandelson's explanations. That phrase is revealing in a different way. It suggests that personal trust and insider validation may have played a larger role than hard procedural skepticism. This is how elite systems often break down. The formal process remains intact on the surface, but the real decision is made through a smaller circle of confidence, familiarity, and political calculation. The file exists, the concerns are logged, the warnings are spoken, but the outcome is shaped elsewhere. This is the oldest problem in democratic power. Official structures are built to impose friction, but inner circles are built to remove it. And when the inner circle decides that a figure is too useful, too experienced, or too valuable to lose, formal warnings begin to get translated into manageable optics instead of disqualifying facts. That is not discipline. That is hierarchy-bending procedure to protect a preferred result. So the real lesson of this stage is brutal but clear. The red flags were not hidden in the shadows. They were in the room. The system did not fail to notice danger. It failed to respect it. And once a government starts teaching itself that inconvenient warnings can be softened by insider confidence, it is no longer just taking risk. It is manufacturing future crisis with its eyes open. The vetting timeline points to a dangerous institutional shortcut. If there is one part of the Mandelson affair that should make serious government stop and think, it is this one. Scandals tied to judgment are politically damaging. Scandals tied to security procedure are more dangerous, because they expose not just a bad decision, but a weakened system. And that is exactly what this vetting timeline appears to reveal. The issue here is not simply that Peter Mandelson was controversial. The issue is that the machinery designed to control access to sensitive state information may have been forced to run behind a political decision that was already moving too fast. That matters because vetting is not ceremonial paperwork. It is not an administrative annoyance. It is the state's immune system. It exists for one reason: to make sure access to highly sensitive material follows verified trust, not assumed trust. Once that order is reversed, the state begins operating on reputation, status, and convenience rather than discipline. And when that happens at the level of the UK ambassador to Washington, the danger is not symbolic. It is strategic. The timeline is what makes this so serious. Mandelson was offered in-person briefings, including at higher tiers, before the formal clearance process appears to have fully concluded. His developed vetting confirmation came later. Strap clearance, which points to an even more sensitive level of access, was not initiated until after key steps in onboarding were already underway. On top of that, the Foreign Office's own guidance indicated that such clearance should be handled well in advance of taking up post. That is not a minor technical mismatch. That is the system's written rule pointing one way while the political process moved another. In plain language, the gate seems to have opened before the lock was fully tested. That is the shortcut. And the reason shortcuts matter in security culture is simple: they never stay isolated for long. Every exception teaches the institution a lesson. If a powerful, well-connected, politically useful figure can be advanced through the system before the process is complete, then the real rule is no longer the written standard. The real rule becomes this: some people are too important to wait. That is how formal safeguards decay without anyone publicly announcing that they are being weakened. This is also a classic case of risk being shifted downward. The political center gets the speed, the appearance of control, and the diplomatic momentum of moving quickly. The institution absorbs the uncertainty. If nothing goes wrong, the shortcut is forgotten and the decision-makers look decisive. If something does go wrong, the damage is spread across the state: credibility, trust, internal morale, alliance confidence, and the integrity of future vetting itself. That is moral hazard in government form. And let's be honest about the broader signal this sends. Britain is not handling a routine staffing matter when it appoints its ambassador to Washington. It is placing a figure at the intersection of diplomacy, intelligence trust, defense coordination, and transatlantic strategy. In that environment, procedure is substance. The process is part of the message. If allies, officials, or the public begin to suspect that security gates bend for insiders, confidence does not collapse all at once. It starts to erode quietly, and then all at once when the next crisis hits. That is why this matters so much. The vetting timeline does not just suggest administrative sloppiness. It points to something more corrosive: a state structure that may have allowed political urgency to outrun institutional caution. And when a government starts doing that around access to highly classified material, it is no longer merely managing risk. It is normalizing it. Why Mandelson was seen as worth the risk. To understand why this appointment happened at all, we have to move beyond outrage and into the harder question: what made Peter Mandelson look worth the danger to the people at the top? That is where the real anatomy of power begins. Governments do not take risks like this by accident. They do it because, somewhere inside the decision-making core, someone concludes that the upside is too attractive to walk away from. That is almost certainly what happened here. Peter Mandelson was not viewed as an ordinary political figure. He was seen as a high-value operator, a man with reach, fluency, confidence, and the kind of elite networking skills that many modern governments quietly worship. He knew how to move through systems of influence. He understood business, media, diplomacy, and the psychology of power. For a prime minister trying to place a heavyweight in Washington, that kind of profile can become intoxicating. In rooms where strategy is discussed at the highest level, competence often carries a glamour of its own. And that is exactly where the trap is set. In politics, just as in finance, institutions are often tempted by assets that promise unusually high returns while carrying unusually high hidden risk. Mandelson appears to have been treated like that kind of asset. He was not clean, but he was useful. He was not low risk, but he was seen as potentially high yield. That is the language governments rarely say out loud, but it is often the language they act on. They tell themselves they are making a tough-minded calculation. In truth, they may be rationalizing exposure they would never tolerate in someone less connected. This is an old elite instinct. When the world feels unstable, leaders often reach for veterans, not because veterans are safer, but because they feel more controllable. A seasoned insider gives the illusion of certainty. He knows the players. He understands the codes. He can make calls that others cannot make. In the short term, that can feel like strategic strength. But in democratic systems, that logic is dangerous because it confuses tactical skill with institutional trustworthiness. The two are not the same, and when leaders blur them, the whole system begins pricing brilliance above legitimacy. That may be the deepest lesson here. Mandelson's perceived value likely did not erase the concerns around him. It made those concerns easier to discount. Once a powerful figure is judged worth the risk, every warning that follows starts getting translated into something softer. A liability becomes a communications problem. A conflict becomes a manageable complication. A serious vulnerability becomes a price of doing business. This is how bad appointments survive internal scrutiny. The conclusion is reached first, and then the risk analysis bends around it. There is also a harder political truth. High-level appointments are never only about merit. They are about leverage, access, message, and power projection. Sending Peter Mandelson to Washington may have looked, to some around Keir Starmer, like sending a signal of strength, a sharp operator, a global insider, a man who could hold his own in the most strategic capital in the Western Alliance. But that same signal carried another message too, whether intended or not, that this government was prepared to gamble institutional credibility on elite utility. And that is the core failure. Mandelson was not chosen because the risks disappeared. He was chosen because influential people seemed to have convinced themselves that his value outweighed them. That is not prudence. That is strategic overconfidence. And in politics, overconfidence at the top rarely stays contained. Sooner or later, the full cost moves outward and the public is left to absorb what the insiders once called a smart bet. The severance fight exposed the financial logic of power. The fight over Peter Mandelson's severance payment matters for one reason above all: it exposes how power protects itself when a high-level political gamble collapses. Most scandals are discussed in moral language first. Who knew what, who failed, who lied, who looked away. But sooner or later, every scandal reaches the balance sheet. And when it does, the numbers tell a story that the speeches often try to hide. In this case, the story is not just about compensation. It is about leverage, fear, containment, and the financial cost of elite misjudgment. The documents show that Mandelson initially sought roughly £547,000, effectively the remaining value of his contract. He ultimately received £75,000. On the surface, some will say that proves the government held the line. But that is too shallow. The more revealing point is that the negotiation happened at all in the shadow of such a damaging collapse. A man whose appointment had already become politically radioactive still entered the exit process with bargaining power. That fact alone tells us something important about how the upper floors of government work. Even in failure, insiders do not leave empty-handed if the system believes they still carry risk on the way out. That is the financial logic of power. Governments do not only pay for service. They also pay for silence, speed, stability, and legal closure. Not in the crude sense of buying loyalty, but in the institutional sense of reducing volatility. Officials appear to have concluded that a controlled settlement was cheaper than a prolonged dispute. From a narrow managerial standpoint, that logic is easy to understand. Litigation is expensive. Public hearings are messy. Employment claims drag on. Political scandal grows more toxic when it is fed by procedural warfare. In transaction cost terms, a smaller payment now can look cheaper than a larger institutional headache later. But the accounting logic is only one layer. The democratic logic is much harsher. When the state uses public money to settle the fallout from a failed elite appointment, the public becomes the absorber of a mistake it did not make. That is where outrage starts to harden. Taxpayers are not just funding government. They are, in moments like this, underwriting the cleanup cost of bad judgment at the top. The message people hear is brutally simple: the powerful take the gamble, and the public pays when it goes wrong. There is also a strategic signal in the scale of Mandelson's opening demand. Asking for the full value of the contract suggests he did not view himself as a disgraced figure with no room to maneuver. He seems to have understood that the government had incentives of its own, to avoid escalation, to reduce reputational damage, to close the file before it turned into an even uglier fight. That is what makes this episode so revealing. Exit itself becomes a form of negotiation between two vulnerable sides, the dismissed insider trying to preserve value, and the government trying to cap the price of its own failed decision. So this was never just a severance dispute. It was a real-time lesson in how elite systems price failure. Not according to moral clarity, but according to legal exposure, media risk, internal panic, and the urgent desire to keep one bad appointment from becoming an even bigger institutional wound. That is why this matters. The £75,000 was not simply a payment. It was the visible receipt for a deeper truth: when power misjudges, the cleanup is almost never free. What we still don't know may be more damaging than what we do. What we still do not know may be the most politically dangerous part of this entire affair. Not because uncertainty is dramatic, but because in government, uncertainty changes the structure of blame. Once key facts are withheld, every side gains room to defend itself, accuse the other, and shape the public story before the full record arrives. That is exactly where Keir Starmer's government now finds itself. The released documents are damaging enough. But the missing material may decide whether this was a case of Peter Mandelson deceiving the center of power, or a case of the center of power seeing enough to know better and moving ahead anyway. That distinction is everything. The most important gap is still the most direct one: what exactly did Peter Mandelson tell Number 10 and officials during the vetting process about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? Starmer has said Mandelson misled his team about the depth and extent of that relationship. Mandelson is understood to dispute that. Right there is the unresolved core of the scandal. If Mandelson plainly concealed crucial facts, Starmer can argue that he was politically damaged by a false account. But if the withheld documents show that the warnings were broader, clearer, or harder than Downing Street now implies, then the problem moves from deception to judgment. And that would be much more dangerous for the Prime Minister. This is why the Metropolitan Police investigation matters far beyond the legal sphere. The decision to withhold key material may be defensible from an investigative standpoint, but politically it leaves the country inside a vacuum. And power hates a vacuum because vacuums do not stay empty. They fill with suspicion. They fill with inference. They fill with the public's oldest conclusion about scandal: if the full truth is not available, then the visible truth is probably only part of the story. In financial markets, undisclosed liabilities raise the cost of trust long before the books are opened. Politics works the same way. Once voters believe that the decisive evidence is still under lock and key, they begin to price in risk. Not just risk to Mandelson, but risk to Starmer, to Downing Street, and to the wider credibility of the state. Transparency is not a moral luxury in moments like this. It is a stabilizing force. And when transparency is delayed, instability becomes the price. There are several possibilities ahead, and none is politically comfortable. One is that the missing documents validate Starmer's defense and show that Mandelson withheld the most damaging facts. Another is that the documents reveal a broader circle of awareness inside government than has been publicly acknowledged. A third possibility, and perhaps the most corrosive, is that the record shows ambiguity was tolerated because Mandelson was seen as too useful to discard. That would not be a narrow personal scandal. That would be a governing culture problem. And that is why this phase is so combustible. The facts already released have done real damage. But the facts still withheld hold the power to reorder the entire meaning of the story. Until those documents are known, the scandal remains open, the political risk remains live, and the most important judgment in this affair is still suspended in the dark. The real political damage falls on Starmer, not Mandelson. In the public mind, Peter Mandelson is the scandal. But in political terms, Keir Starmer is the one carrying the deeper wound. Mandelson has already suffered the visible fall. He lost the office, lost the standing, and became the face of the disgrace. That part is easy to see. What is harder to see, but far more important, is where the lasting damage lands. It lands on the Prime Minister who made the call, defended the call, and now has to live with the fact that every new document turns the spotlight back onto his judgment. That is how power works at the top. The subordinate may take the immediate hit, but the leader absorbs the long shadow. And shadows matter in politics because authority is not just about holding office. It is about persuading allies, civil servants, markets, partners, and voters that your decisions are grounded, disciplined, and safe. Once that belief starts to weaken, every future decision becomes harder. Every appointment is questioned more quickly. Every assurance sounds thinner. Every controversy becomes easier to fit into a growing pattern. That is the real danger for Starmer. This is not only about one failed appointment. It is about the emergence of a narrative. And narratives, once established, are more powerful than press releases. The narrative now taking shape is simple and brutal. The warnings were there, the risks were there, the system raised concerns, and yet the decision still went forward. That is the kind of story that does not disappear when a man is fired. It follows the person who signed off on the gamble. For Labour MPs, this matters in a very specific way. Political parties can forgive a bad week. They can forgive a media storm. What they struggle to forgive is a prime minister whose instincts begin to look unreliable at the center of government. Once colleagues start to suspect that judgment at the top can be bent by insider pressure, personal trust, or overconfidence in elite operators, the damage becomes cumulative. It does not always explode at once. It chips away, slowly and relentlessly, at the leader's internal authority. And that erosion has strategic consequences. A weakened prime minister becomes more cautious where he should be bold, and more defensive where he should be clear. Advisors start managing perception instead of solving problems. Opponents grow louder because they sense vulnerability. Even allies begin adjusting their behavior, not necessarily out of disloyalty, but out of calculation. They ask themselves a quiet question every political professional asks sooner or later: is this leader still fully in command of his own government? That is why Mandelson's fall is only the surface event. The deeper story is Starmer's exposure. The scandal has moved beyond Mandelson's conduct and into the much more dangerous territory of leadership credibility. Every new release, every fresh development from the Metropolitan Police, every reminder of what Jonathan Powell and others warned, presses on the same bruise. And in politics, repeated pressure on the same weak point is how authority begins to break down. Mandelson may remain the scandal's main character. But Starmer is the one whose future is being judged by it. That is the true political cost here. Not one embarrassment, not one bad headline, but a slow and public test of whether the Prime Minister's judgment can still command trust when the stakes are highest. What comes next? The strategic stakes for Britain, Washington, and democratic trust. What comes next will determine whether this affair remains a damaging scandal or hardens into something far worse, a long-term failure of trust at the top of government. That is the real strategic stake now. The first wave of documents has already done enough to expose weakness in judgment, weakness in process, and weakness in the way risk was handled around Peter Mandelson. But the next phase is more dangerous, because this is the phase where institutions either recover credibility or lose more of it with every delayed answer, every partial disclosure, and every sign that the system is still protecting itself from full accountability. There are now 3 clocks running at once, and each one carries its own danger. The first is the legal clock. The Metropolitan Police investigation remains a live factor, which means the story is not politically settled no matter how badly Downing Street may want to move on. As long as investigators are still examining material connected to Mandelson, the government remains trapped in an unstable middle ground. It cannot fully close the story, but it cannot fully explain it either. That is a bad place for any administration to live. In politics, unresolved legal exposure does not simply delay closure. It drains authority over time. The second is the disclosure clock. More documents are expected. More messages may emerge. More internal exchanges may come into view. That matters because this crisis is no longer driven by one explosive revelation. It is being driven by accumulation. Each new release has the power to do one of two things: either strengthen Keir Starmer's case that he was misled, or deepen the suspicion that the center of government saw more risk than it now wants to admit. That is why every new trench matters so much. This is no longer a single event scandal. It is a rolling stress test of state credibility. The third is the reform clock, and in the long run it may be the most important of all. Governments survive scandal when they prove they can learn faster than the damage spreads. That means more than changing a line in a vetting procedure. It means answering harder structural questions. Who gets to override concern from senior officials? What standard applies when political usefulness collides with reputational and security risk? How far can informal trust inside a leader's inner circle shape decisions that are supposed to be governed by formal scrutiny? If those questions are not answered clearly, then Britain will not have fixed the problem. It will only have patched the surface. And American viewers should not dismiss this as a domestic British drama. The UK ambassador to Washington sits inside one of the most important democratic relationships in the world. Britain's credibility in that role affects alliance trust, strategic coordination, intelligence confidence, and the broader perception of whether serious democratic states still know how to police the boundary between influence and accountability. That is why the final lesson here is bigger than Mandelson, bigger than Starmer, and even bigger than one government. Democracies do not stay strong because powerful people promise good intentions. They stay strong because institutions are able to say no when saying yes would be easier, faster, and more convenient. What the Mandelson documents have already revealed is serious enough. But what comes next will tell us something even more important: whether Britain still has the institutional strength to correct itself before a scandal of judgment becomes a deeper crisis of democratic trust. In the end, the Mandelson story is not just about one man's fall. It is about how power behaves when status, access, and political usefulness begin to outrun judgment. Peter Mandelson did not become a national problem simply because he carried controversy. He became a national problem because a modern government appears to have looked at visible risk, understood that risk, and still convinced itself that the gamble was manageable. That is what gives this story its lasting force. Keir Starmer did not just inherit a difficult situation. He now stands exposed by the most dangerous kind of political failure, not a failure of information alone, but a failure of restraint. The released documents suggest that warnings existed, senior figures had concerns, the vetting timeline raised serious questions, and the cost of the decision spread outward into diplomacy, security, public trust and political authority. What began as the appointment of Peter Mandelson to Washington became a broader test of how seriously the British state treats reputational danger, institutional discipline, and democratic accountability. And because key facts are still withheld, the crisis remains unfinished. That uncertainty is part of the damage. It keeps the wound open, keeps public suspicion alive, and keeps pressure on the government at the very point where leadership is supposed to look strongest. The deepest lesson from this story is simple, but powerful: in politics, in business, and in everyday life, talent should never blind us to character, and convenience should never outrank principle. When people ignore warning signs because someone seems useful, brilliant, or connected, the hidden cost usually arrives later, and it is almost always higher than expected. In our own lives, that lesson matters too. Choose carefully who you trust, pay attention to patterns instead of promises, and never assume that intelligence or success automatically means integrity. The strongest decisions are not the fastest ones. They are the ones that can survive scrutiny when the full truth comes out. Here's a quick question for you: what was the deeper failure in this story? A. Peter Mandelson's personal conduct was the main problem. B. The bigger problem was that the system saw the risks and moved forward anyway. Comment A or B below. And what do you think this scandal really says about Keir Starmer's judgment, Britain's institutions, and the way power protects itself at the top? Share your view in the comments so everyone can learn from your perspective. And subscribe to the channel to support more sharp, honest analysis ahead.